Today, I want to talk about intervals a lot more. And we've touched on intervals because intervals were integral for learning our scales. We learned the whole steps and the half steps and how patterns of these intervals, patterns of whole steps and half steps, can be situated together to make scales. So basically what we're going to cover today is every other kind of interval, all the larger intervals, all the ways we can measure from this note to that note. And that's just what an interval is. Interval just measures the distance between two notes. Now we measure intervals in two ways, and we're going to talk about both at some length. But the first way is in terms of their overall size, and the size is just calculated based on their number of scale steps or letter names. And we've kind of seen this thing before. The size is just calculated in terms of the number of scale steps. In other words, the number of letter names that distance the two notes. So think of it this way, like C to C, that would be a U, a unison, or a one. C to D, that's going to be a second. C to E, C to E, C to E, that's going to be a third. C to F, a fourth. C to G, a fifth, and so on. And we can see that here. The unison, C to C. C to D, that's going to be a second. C to E, that's going to be a third. C, D, E, F, that's going to be a fourth. C, D, E, F, G, that's going to be a fifth, and so on. And you can see C to A there, C to B, C to C. C to C, we know that too. That's the octave. That's going to be all the way up to 8. But you might already be wondering, take C to A. So we've got C to A, that's a sixth. Well, what about C to A flat? This once again is just C major, just all the white notes. It leaves some notes out. So we've also got C to A flat. That's going to be a half step smaller than C to A, but they're both going to be some kind of sixth. It's still C to A, it's still a sixth, but now it's a half step smaller, C to A flat. So we're going to need a second way of measuring. We're going to need a qualifying thing, a second qualifier that's going to tell us this is specifically how many half steps are contained in that sixth. That way we can tell the difference between the big sixth, C to A, and the smaller sixth, C to A flat. And that goes for almost all the intervals there. So the second way we measure is called interval quality. So we've got these two things, interval size, the letter names, and interval quality, which is going to tell us exactly how many half steps is contained in the interval. It's going to specify what kind of sixth, what kind of fourth, what kind of second, what kind of third, and so on. Actually, when it comes to what kind of second, we've already dealt with seconds, right? We had C to D, that was a whole step. And C to D flat, that was the smaller step. So we had a big step and a small step, just like with the sixths, big sixth, small sixth. Now with big step, small step, big second, small second. So the whole step is actually a major second. And the half step is actually a minor second. And these are just different names for the same interval. So we've been calling them whole and half steps, and we saw how we can make scales with those. Other terms for these would be just major second and minor second. And you can see there that minor second is 1 half step, is equal to 1 half step, and the major second is equal to a whole step, or 2 half steps. And so these terms major and minor, we're going to use them a lot, and we've seen major and minor scales, but for now, I think it's easiest to think of major as meaning big and minor as meaning small. And that's really what they mean. Major is the big second and minor is the small second. We'll see that goes for a lot of the intervals as well. So a major sixth is going to be C to A. That's the big sixth. And a minor sixth is going to be C to A flat. That's the smaller sixth. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Those two ways. First, starting with the size, just the basic letter names, then specifying, is it the big sixth or the small sixth? Is it the big third or the small third? Big second or small second? And that's where major and minor are going to come in. So we can see in this chart, starting at the unison, C to C, climbing up chromatically, we're going to get C to C, C to D flat, C to D natural, C to E flat, C to E natural, C to F sharp. And with all of these, you can see there the names are listed, and then at the top it says the number of semitones. And semitone is just another word for half step. So don't worry about it. Tone is a whole step, semitone is a half step. So we've got a couple different names, right? We've got whole step, half step, we've got major second, minor second, and now we've got tone and semitone. So this is just all to keep in mind the different ways of labeling seconds or steps. So what we see here, unison, minor second, then major second. So the minor second, and then the major second is the bigger one, 2 semitones. 3 semitones is the minor third, C to E flat. 4 semitones is the major third, C to E natural. 5 semitones is the perfect fourth, C to F, and 6 semitones is is what's called the augmented fourth. Okay, so here's a new term, augmented fourth or diminished fifth. Sounds the same as diminished fifth. Let's look at this on the keyboard because I think that'll make a lot more sense. So if I start with the unison, C to C, that's just a unison. Straightforward. C to D flat, minor second, major second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, augmented fourth, C to F sharp. The perfect fourth has been stretched a little bit bigger by 1/2 step, and it's become an augmented fourth. Okay, so we're going to need to clarify these terms. Perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. Otherwise, this chart isn't going to make sense to us yet. First, let's keep going. Just finish up the scale. So we got here to the augmented fourth. Then we have what's called perfect fifth. Then the augmented fifth. A little bit bigger. Notice that's the same as C to A flat, which I already said is also called a minor sixth. So if it's spelled C to G sharp, that's a stretched out fifth. And if it's spelled C to A flat, that's the smaller sixth. C to A natural would be the bigger sixth. C to B flat is a minor seventh, the smaller seventh. C to B natural is the bigger seventh, the major seventh. And then C to C is the octave, or called the perfect octave. And that perfect octave, once again, is 12 semitones, just as we would expect. Once again, we're seeing here how size and quality can tell us the distance between these notes, can just specify, are you talking about the big seventh, the major seventh, or the small seventh, the minor seventh? And all of these things. So once we get used to these interval names and how they overlap with each other, of course, like I already kind of demonstrated, there can be 2 different interval names for the same sound. And we've seen this kind of thing before. What's going to be the result of this musically is that we can learn to see the relationships among the tones. As I already mentioned in the previous videos, this is going to be one of the crucial points of this class. Not just this note and that note, but how do they connect to each other? What are their relationships? And how do those play out over the course of a piece of music? Because I think that's the most important thing, how things relate to each other musically. Okay, so let's keep going. I've called a few of these intervals so-called perfect. So let's take that for example. Now I marked off these ones as perfect. The unison, the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, and the perfect octave. So what exactly do we mean by perfect? Well, like I say, the perfect category involves just these 4 kinds of intervals: unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. And if you think back to the harmonic series, think about the intervals that are generated by the harmonic series and why they might be called perfect. Remember that the first interval generated by the harmonic series, besides the unison, which is just the same note, is the octave. And then the next interval generated by the harmonic series is the fifth. And then the following interval is another octave, and as we'll learn, between those 2 notes is a fourth. So anyways, these 4 kinds of intervals appear right away at the bottom of the harmonic series. And they're also the ones that blend the most smoothly in our ears. Is another reason we call them perfect. So if I just go from the octave and the unison, you can hear that they blend together really well. And then if I come through these other notes, and get to the fifth, I think you'll notice you can hear when the fifth is there. Suddenly the fifth rings out. There was the fifth. Ooh, and then here's the fourth. So those 4 kinds of intervals: the octave, the fifth, the fourth, the fifth, the fourth, and the unison are considered our perfect intervals. And they're, in a way, fixed. Let me show you what I mean. Why, when we say fourth, fifth, octave, that's the size in letter names, right? Is it a fourth? Is it a fifth? Is it an octave? And then the perfect is the quality of it that describes the exact number of half steps. And I mean, they're fixed because the perfect intervals are right smack in the middle. So you've got your fourth, it's always going to be the perfect fourth. You've got your fifth, it's always going to be the perfect fifth. But as we saw before, if you take the perfect fourth and you extend it out by 1 half step, you just raise the top note. Here's the perfect fourth. Raise that top note up by half step, and you get what's called an augmented fourth. Augmented just means stretched. So it's stretched out a little bit bigger. Then, say we took the fifth. Okay, we have the perfect fifth, and it's just perfect. It's just sitting there, right? Now, if we squish this interval, if we take 1 note in by a half step, we actually end up with the same interval we had before, but if this is C to F sharp, then it's an augmented fourth, right? A stretched out fourth. But if it's C to G flat, then we would say this is a squished fifth. This is a diminished fifth. So it really depends on how you're notating it. Is it written C to F sharp? Because then you have C to F, that's a fourth. C to F sharp is a stretched augmented fourth. Or is it written as a fifth? C to G flat. So C to G is a fifth, G flat makes it a diminished fifth. So how it's written really corresponds to what these interval names are going to say about a note. Now I mentioned the other ones, which aren't unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves, are the seconds, the thirds, the sixths, and the sevenths. And these have the quality of being either minor or major, nowhere in between. So with thirds, for example, we're always going to have either a major third or a minor third before we get to a second or a fourth. Right? So there's the fourth, major third, minor third, major second, minor second, and unison. So you notice in there's no room for a perfect third. There's no such thing. As I say, the seconds, the thirds, the sixths, and the sevenths have no middle ground. They're always either major or minor. And we'll see how that fits in with like what we learned about scales later in the video. Again, the difference between major and minor is also just a half step. So major means it's the bigger one, minor means it's the smaller one. There's none in the middle with seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. However, if we stretch them further, say you have a major third, the big third, and you stretch it up by another half step, you add another half step, well, then you're going to end up on a perfect fourth, right? If it's written C to F. However, if it's written C to E sharp, then major and minor intervals can indeed be stretched even further, at which point we'll call them also augmented and diminished. So once again, perfect is right there in the middle, the perfect intervals, and when they get stretched or squished, they become augmented and diminished. Major and minor intervals have no middle, but when they get stretched or squished, they can also become augmented or diminished. And so the quality aspect is a little bit complex, but we're going to get into a lot of examples and do some practice problems later to show you how to work with these. Let's just look at a few more examples, and this is just another shape way of saying the same thing I just said, which is that you see the perfect intervals at the top, and as they become larger by 1/2 step, they become augmented. Same with major. If it becomes larger by 1/2 step, that becomes augmented. Minor, if it becomes smaller by 1/2 step, that's a diminished interval. And the perfect intervals, if they become smaller by 1/2 step, they become diminished. And this moves in both directions. So you can, if the top note goes up a 1/2 step, that also makes it augmented or stretched. And if the bottom note goes down a 1/2 step, that also makes it stretched. So you have to be careful. Like, it's not just, is the note going up or is the note going down? It's more a matter of, is the interval getting bigger or smaller by 1/2 step at a time? This is then kind of the simplified version of that chart that we saw right at the beginning, where we can go up from the bottom of the scale by just having the perfect unison, then the minor second, then the major second, then the minor third, then the major third, then the perfect fourth, then the perfect fifth, minor sixth, major sixth, minor seventh, major seventh, and perfect octave at the very end. One thing is missing from this chart though. So let's take a closer look. If you remember from the keyboard, this covers unison, minor second, major second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth. We skipped one there. Okay, let's take a look at how these look in a little bit clearer notation here. So once again, here is all our chromatic intervals coming from C to C. The perfect ones then I've highlighted in blue. So we can see the perfect unison, the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, and the perfect octave, and where they fit in the whole scope of the scale. The purple ones here are the major and minor intervals, the seconds, the thirds, the sixths, and the sevenths. And we remember them for they can be either the big version or the small version, and there's no middle. Then the one that is left out so far are the two in the middle, which we remember, actually, if you look closely, F sharp and G flat is the same note. And if we remember from the keyboard as we were moving through the scale, with either G flat or F sharp there, we're going to call that the augmented fourth, the stretched out fourth, or the diminished fifth, the squashed fifth. And you can see those in the middle there. They are equal as the augmented fourth and the diminished fifth. There's another term for this, which you might have heard, and it's called the tritone. This is the often considered to be like the kind of weirdest interval on the scale. So if we look at it a little bit closer, we might wonder, okay, this is a very strange interval. You notice that this is right smack dab in the middle of the octave. There's 6 semitones away from it going up and 6 semitones away from it going down, total of 12. So from C to F sharp, 6 semitones. From F sharp to C, 6 semitones. And they have that crunchy, weird sound. So one thing I want you to remember here is that symmetry is very complicated in music theory, because the most obviously symmetrical interval is actually like not a very desirable sound. Compared to, for example, the fifth, which has this clear quality to it. So when I say desirable, I mean the quality may be desirable for what you want to express, but it's distinctly different quality than the fifth, which is clear and nice, and then the diminished fifth, which is like jarring and strange, you must admit. So we call this the tritone actually because, as I mentioned, we have these different names for the steps. We've got whole steps and half steps. We've got major seconds and minor seconds. We have semitones and then tones. So tone is the whole step and semitone is the half step. So if we've got tritone, well, that just means 3 tones. Let's go 3 whole steps. If you go 3 whole steps in a row, you get the tritone. Tritone, 3 steps, 3 whole steps. Now remember back to our scales, major and minor. Neither of them had 3 whole steps from the root note. It was either whole, half for major, or whole, half, whole for minor. So neither of them ever got to that note, G flat or F sharp, is not in either the major or minor scale. It appears elsewhere. which we will see. So with that, I hope you can get an idea of all the notes contained within the octave measured up from the bottom. We can span these intervals, which are going to be our most commonly seen and most useful intervals. There's other intervals we could have. We could have augmented fifth. We could have diminished sevenths. We could have diminished thirds or augmented seconds or something like that. But we won't worry about that for right now. Right now, between the unison and the octave, we've measured out these intervals, which are going to be our most used and most relevant intervals for most of what we need to do.